Good evening, everyone. What's good, y'all? All right. First off, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for those who have worked hard in the School of Woodring and elsewhere for this event to be possible. Thank you for our speaker for making the travels out here. And again, thank you for coming out here and being part of this. My name is Nick Courtney. I am a graduate student here at Western Washington University, getting my master's in teaching. And thanks. I'm going to give a brief introduction to kind of what brought us here today. And then my fabulous colleague, Elaine, is going to be introducing our speaker. So, I'm going to rewind the clocks just a little bit to 2008. I was a junior in high school. I'm now 23, so that gives a little bit of context. Some of you who may be freshmen here could possibly have been in middle school then. But in the inaugural speech of 2008, President Bruce Shepard made the statement, quote, "If we are as white in 10 years as we are today, Western would have failed as an institution." It was intended, according to President Bruce, to provide conversations on our campus that went wide and deep, thoughtful and informed. In the spring of 2014, a right-winged Southern lobbyist attacked Bruce on Twitter, framing his comments as threatening to white folks, and that was trended for about 2 weeks on news and social media. Some of you may have remembered the news actually being here on campus. Some of you kind of can understand what that was about. After that, a small group of white supremacists were on our campus near our Viking Union and held a banner that said, "Diversity equals white genocide." After that, a group of students, pulled together and organized a big rally through campus that said that we supported diversity here on campus. Many of you were part of that. Some of you organized that. So I really want to raise my hands to those folks that kind of started that. At this rally, a separate group of students also formed. They advocated for not only a rise in diversity, but that Western better support those diverse students that were already here, claiming that diversity was not enough. And that just the number of students entering Western was not the case, but again, supporting them and having their culture reflected and their own identities here on campus. A group of Woodring administrators, staff, faculty, and students then came together to provide evidence and information in the form of a poster walk that gave counter-narrative to the idea that students of color were equally supported, benefiting, and succeeding in systems of higher education. So that was our first teach-in event. Our second teach-in event was in this fall, and that was entitled Power, Privilege, Difference, and Oppression. A group of AS students, along with Dr. Vero, who many of you know, presented on multiple student identities and racial microaggressions. Throughout these events, we have gathered student and faculty and staff and community evaluations, which have kind of framed where we are today. And where we are today is a room full of students, staff, faculty, community teachers, community administrators. So I really want to give a round of applause again to all of you who have made this possible and continue to make this possible. I'd also like to acknowledge the land that we stand on as traditional Lummi land and to the Lummi people, and I raise my hands to them and just like to keep them in our thoughts while we go on with the night. And with that, I'd like to introduce Elaine, and she will be introducing our speaker for the night.
I brought my class here tonight, so hi y'all. Good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Elaine Mahari, and I'm an instructor in Woodring's education. Oh, how about now? All right. My name is Elaine Mahari, and I'm an instructor in Woodring's education and social justice minor, and also a staff member in the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity, two of the many departments involved in co-sponsoring tonight's teach-in event. And I am so pleased to have the chance to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Wayne Au. Dr. Au's extensive work encompasses social justice education and critical educational theory within the current political context of schooling. He's an assistant professor in the education programs at the University of Washington, Bothell, and is also editor of Rethinking Schools, an educational magazine that considers alternative visions of schooling that aim to create a humane, caring, and multiracial democracy. His most recent publications include a co-edited piece entitled Pencils Down, Rethinking High-Stakes Testing and Accountability in Public Schools, published in Rethinking Schools in 2012, and a chapter entitled High-Stakes Testing, A Tool for White Supremacy for Over 100 Years, from the forthcoming 2015 book, What's Race Got to Do with It? How Current School Reform Maintains Racial and Economic Inequality. For his talk tonight, Dr. Au will discuss the pervasiveness of high-stakes testing in neoliberal educational policy, including the disparate impacts of high-stakes testing on students of color, and the ways in which these tests sustain white supremacy through the guise of offering individual inequality and so-called objective measures of student performance. He will also discuss how the neoliberal restructuring of public education has resulted in a shift from democratic government to an increase in non-democratic control by corporations, nonprofit organizations, and philanthropies. Drawing from this upcoming co-edited collection, he will offer a framework for the rise of neoliberal influence in education and share examples of institutionalized racism in neoliberal education policy in the US. Dr. Au's work critiques how neoliberalism perpetuates the myth of meritocracy, foregrounds corporate interests at the expense of public education, and maintains a status quo of institutional racism and white supremacy in our education systems. In particular, Dr. Au will illustrate how the influence of neoliberal education leads schools to emphasize increasing academic performance over increasing educational equity through racially and socioeconomically biased practices such as high-stakes testing. Dr. Au's research prompts us to ask critical questions about the purpose of public education and how we reflect those understandings through our educational policies and practices. In reflecting on his work, we are encouraged to ask ourselves if the purpose of public education is to serve the interests of the state and the market, or the interests of our students and local school communities. Should the role of public schooling be to produce a labor force to fulfill economic needs determined by corporations? Or should it prepare students and educators to create personally meaningful understandings of their world and foster the knowledge and critical thinking skills to enact social change and challenge oppressive ideologies and institutions every day? Tonight, we have the unique opportunity to learn with and from a foremost scholar in the fields of multicultural education and education for social justice. So we invite you to listen with a hungry heart and prepare to enact educational equity by listening for ways to interrupt oppression in our own schools and communities every day. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wayne Au.
Okay, let's see. How's the lapel mic working? Can you hear me okay or not? I don't know. I'm trying to louder. Crank it up. Better. No. Man. Okay. We'll see. We'll have to play with it. Maybe I'll have to be up here. I like to move around when I talk, and so I prefer the lapel mic, but if this is going to work better, then we can roll with that too. Oh, we'll put it up here.
Now try it.
Is that better? Oh, wait, let's see. So that's better? Okay. All right, so thank you for having me. This is really wonderful. Great crowd. I love to see all y'all out here today. And I really appreciate the folks up here at Western, all the various co-sponsors. Pretty long list of folks who brought me up here. You know, I have a lot of good friends up here, and I'm always just happy to get up here and get to like connect with my peoples. So, you know, tonight my talk is going to be largely around thinking about the current crop of education reforms that we're all sort of dealing with right now, and sort of my central sort of thesis, the central piece of my argument is to basically say, you know, public education is being restructured in this country in very particular ways, and it is actually a racial project. We need to understand it as a racial project, and so I'm going to be talking about how those pieces come together in all this. So let's get started. Okay, so we'll ditch this for the moment. Yeah, if you want to reshuffle, I'll wait a minute if folks want to make a quick move. That's fine. Okay, that'll help. Okay. All right, so whenever I talk about thinking about education reform, I think we always need to ground ourselves in the fundamental understanding that historically public education has not met the needs of low-income and kids of color. Right? And kids with disabilities, English language learners. It is not a perfect system, and it's a system that in many ways has been set up to reproduce inequality. Now, I say that as a critique of public education, even at the same time as that I'm a supporter of public education as well. I think we're not meeting the potential that public education brings with us. So we need. I just always want to recognize this. But what has happened is that education reformers have used this fact to essentially launch an agenda to reshape and reform public education in very particular ways in the United States. And I hope the Prezi doesn't give you motion sickness, right? Like all the spinning and stuff. Okay, so I'm starting here with talking about neoliberalism. All right, for those of you who saw my talk earlier, I'm gonna cover some of the same terrain as I did, but just a little bit, and then I'm go off in a different direction. So neoliberalism is a theory of political and economic practices proposing that human well-being can be best advanced by the maximization of entrepreneurial freedoms within an institutional framework characterized by private property rights, individual liberty, unencumbered markets, and free trade. And that's David Harvey, who's a wonderful Marxist geographer. And then I also like to turn to Pauline Littman, who's also a wonderful education scholar, and she describes neoliberalism as an ensemble of economic and social policies, forms of governance, and discourses of ideologies that promote self-interest, unrestricted flows of capital, deep reductions in the cost of labor, and a sharp retrenchment of the public sphere. And so I hope you can see sort of the pattern there. Neoliberalism is about deregulation, the quote-unquote freeing of markets, and it's even more than just that from in a policy level, because it actually gets down to our how we see ourselves, because the idea of a human being within neoliberalism is that it's individual self-interest, and you're just maximizing your potential as an individual, and that's the best way for society to run. It's not about the public sphere or about the commons. It's all about me, and that's how, sort of like if you took Adam Smith's idea and just unfolded it on everything, right? It's the free market. Sorry, I should have switched this. So yeah, so it's the magic of the free market, right? Deregulate, privatize, everything public is bad, and then everything private is good. And that's sort of the underlying logics to it all. Now, neoliberalism has a particular view of how we should think about government in the state, okay? It wants a small government. You can't get away with it get rid of it entirely. Neoliberalism wants sort of a small government because part of it is there's some functions that need to happen. for instance, neoliberalism obviously is based on sort of capitalism and money, so you need something to maintain the integrity of currency, right, to maintain money as a structure, as a form. It needs to maintain a military. Neoliberalism wants a small government to keep track of property rights, right? All of this stuff around ownership and buying and selling and production can't work if you don't have this concept of property rights, so the state needs to be around to deal with that. One of the roles of the state is also to create markets where some didn't exist. For instance, education or healthcare, like anything that could be opened up into a market, that's part of the role of the state, right? To go ahead and help make that happen. Put it into the hands of private interests. And then also, another critical role of the state under neoliberalism is to set up tax policies and essentially function to redistribute wealth upwards. Okay, and we're in the midst of that right now. Every time, you can turn to any paper on any day and talk about the fact that, for instance, just recently it was reported that over half of the students in public schools now are officially considered in poverty, right? We're seeing where the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest is getting huge, and you can just see the inequalities just continue to grow every day. And so that would be part of the function of how neoliberalism just works. So under neoliberalism, we see entire sectors of the social reproduction side of the welfare state, like in healthcare and education, being rapidly capitalized, right? As entrepreneurs search for new profitable markets, always in the search for new markets, right? And remember, new markets is just about making money, okay? And that's from Michelle Fine and Michael Fabricant. And there's a great concept by another concept by David Harvey. He calls this accumulation by dispossession. And so what you want to think about is you essentially have all this public money, right, going into public programs, but under neoliberalism, that stuff is being privatized, so the public money is being accumulated. It's being dispossessed of the public and being accumulated into private interests at the same time, right, as you start moving everything towards corporations sort of doing all the things that supposedly doing the things that the state might have provided previously. So one thing that happens then is, see, as you have the state shrinking, there's a power vacuum that's created, right? Because these things that the state used to do, that the government used to do, starts to they're not doing it anymore, and someone's got to do those things, and you see that being sort of, that space being occupied by corporations and private interests under neoliberalism, all right? And so Pauline Littman talks about how what happens is when you have the shift going on, we get the shift from government, which would have been by the state, to governance. That's when you have power being exercised by these corporations and these other interests. So in Pauline's words, and I'm sorry for the people in back, this is a pretty small projection if you can't see it. The triumph of market ideology is coupled with an erosion of the idea that informed citizens should make decisions based on the general welfare. The shift from government by elected state bodies and a degree of democratic accountability to governance by experts and managers and decision-making by judicial authority and executive order is central to neoliberal policymaking. Public-private partnerships, appointed managers, and publicly unaccountable bodies comprised of appointed state and corporate leaders make decisions about urban development, transportation, schools, and other public infrastructure using business rationales. In these arrangements, the state acts as an agent of capital. Okay? And this will get illustrated a little more in some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, like around charter school policy in Washington State. Okay, so let's think about what does neoliberalism look like in policy and practice then, okay? So the first thing, it's all about the market. So here's Fabricant, Michelle Fine, and Michael Fabricant again, talking about education as a marketplace under neoliberalism. In public education, we have witnessed the ascent of charter schools, virtual learning, market curricula development, and the expansive number of firms engaged in the measurement and assessment of teachers, with a host of entrepreneurs making large and small profits. More specifically, profit-making extends from publishers capitalizing on the new standards-based testing curricula to high-tech companies experimenting and testing their curricular interventions, Hello, Common Core, and Smarter Balanced, to real estate operators leasing property to exorbitant fees, to alternative certification programs, and finally, for-profit schools. Each of these fragments, pieces of profit-making, are part of a new, quote-unquote, gold rush to capitalize on the $500 billion of public assets being redistributed from neighborhood K-12 public schooling to the marketplace. Okay, and that number is old. For this year, it was estimated to be going around $700 billion for the K-12 marketplace, but it is a pile of dough, right? And these folks want it. It's like you can see them licking their chops. And so what does this mean in terms of reconfiguring public education? okay? First of all, is you start seeing education as a competitive marketplace, okay? Students and teachers and administrators and schools and districts are compared and ranked using test scores, right? That's very akin. I don't know if you heard about how Gates used to have Microsoft done as a stack ranking thing. It's super competitive, and the best, like, it was all based on your metrics of how you produced and all this kind of stuff, and then that's how they functioned as a company, right? Unions are framed as a barrier to market competition, right? The idea of a union and having due process and tenure becomes seen as, oh, this gets in the way of our ability to hire and fire teachers. Supposedly, that's the myth, at least. And so it doesn't allow us to have the free marketplace of teacher labor. Neoliberalism in education, you also see deregulation and deprofessionalization of teaching and teacher preparation, okay? So deregulation comes in the form of, say, Teach for America. You know, the idea that you can just take any old body from some quote-unquote elite university, train them for 5 weeks and plop them into a classroom, and that's going to be like this great thing for kids. And in the process, you circumvent all of the research that we know and all the regulations that we understand that we've put in place to have really good teachers, okay? And so you can just jump that stuff and become a teacher through TFA. And so you see that kind of deregulation. You also see the deprofessionalization of teaching and in terms of teaching itself, right? Because now, you know, teachers, like, if teachers now are more and more faced with like scripted curriculum, okay? Because of the test, like, you got to teach this test. We want our kids to have a good test score. You got to teach the test. And so in order to teach literacy here for this 4th grader, you need to be teaching this curriculum, saying these things on this day for this lesson plan. If a kid's asks you a question, in some of these places it literally says, if a kid asks you a question, you have to just repeat what is said in the book, right? And then principals can go around and evaluate you and make sure that you are on the right thing on the right day, right? That's not happening in all places, but it is happening in some places. So you get to see, though, this idea that teaching becomes essentially beholden to the tests, and that you start to take away the professional decisions of teachers, right? Of what they know is good for kids, what's best to work with this kid or that kid. Like, that starts to disappear. And then we get this shifting of seeing schools like businesses. That schools become deregulated. Functionally, charter schools are the deregulation of public schools, okay? And there's a whole process I'll talk about a little more later around closing, for instance, treating schools like small mom and pop stores. And the good stores will have lots of customers, students, right? And they'll thrive. And the bad stores won't get customers, they won't have students, and they're going to shut down. Okay, and that's sort of the model that the charter school stuff, that you see this sort of schools like businesses competition, and the charters get set up around. And then we also see the shift in education come in the discourse around education, right? District administrators are more and more, you talk about the CEO of this school district, right? Or the chief financial officer, or the chief operations officer. You know, when I was a public school teacher and when I was in public schools, we didn't have any of that. It was never named that kind of stuff, right? This corporate language just gets placed onto our bureaucracies and our structures. Learning also isn't about learning. It becomes about meeting test growth targets and benchmarks, right? So again, very, very sort of production-oriented framework. Students and parents are consumers, okay? You don't talk about communities. You talk about, you know, your consumers, right? Schools become service providers. Education becomes about, quote-unquote, adding value. All right, and then everything becomes about the idea of human capital and sort of shifting education to just being about the needs of the economy. So so I think sort of the common sense framing around education begins to embody you know, this sort of economist sort of discourse and purposes. You know, because you know, I don't know, we could probably come up with 1,000 other purposes for public education in this room alone if we sat down and just thought about it. Right? Whether it is, I don't know, you know, our environment might be on the verge of collapse. Maybe that's something we should be educating people for, or there's massive injustice in the world, or I don't know, there's tons of stuff we could be educating about, and it's not necessarily only about getting a job. And certainly, and I don't deal with this here, but certainly this whole idea that education is responsible for the United States' position in the global economy, that's actually demonstrably false, right? You can trace that internationally. And go like Japan. Japan went through all these huge waves of their economy collapsing and then building back up again and collapsing. And look at their education system; they're actually pretty regularly ranked pretty high internationally during that entire time. Had nothing to do with their education system of education, right? But education kind of gets blamed for everything these days. So, corporate ed reform. What does that mean? Okay, then in terms of the big ideas. Public education is a private enterprise. You want to have individual competition in a deregulated market. Students are products, teachers are laborers, schools are the businesses. Education becomes a standardized process, right? You can feel the factory now, right? I always point that out for like my high school students or folks working in high schools. We still have that remnant of a factory model from 100 years ago, right? You have the students moving at regularly timed intervals with the bells from each point along the assembly line until they graduate, and then you get your receipt. Good, quote unquote, good schools produce high test scores, right? And then they draw more customers and students, and bad schools produce low test scores, and then they're going to fail because they don't have enough customers. So here's my man Bill Gates. This is talking in 2009, okay? When tests are aligned to common standards, and this is just a good example of how the logics work, okay? He said, when tests are aligned to common standards, the curriculum will line up as well, and that will unleash powerful market forces in the service of better teaching. For the first time, there will be a large base of customers eager to buy products that can help every kid learn and every teacher get better. Okay, now really look at that phraseology, okay? Now, who knows? He might really, in his heart of hearts, really want to fix public education and help kids, right? But for him, in the sort of neoliberal paradigm, the only way to do that is through marketizing everything, right? It's creating a large base of customers, right? Unleashing powerful market forces. Great name for a band, by the way, right? Powerful market forces. I was thinking about that. You do a punk band or something? And so that's how these guys approach their problems. These problems are solved in the world. Social problems are solved through the market. And that's the assumption, okay? Okay, now let's see. We're gonna have to play with technology a little bit because I got a little bit of video I want to show you and see if we can get some audio through my computer. So bear with me. Okay. And this is really just another example of how these guys think about public education, all right?
Moment. First up, though, why would I want to add charter schools?
Oh, you can't even hear that. Any way, shape, or form.
Well, I think it's a very stable business, very recession resistant.
Charter schools, and they expect you can increase your investment over this amount of time over these years. Like he's literally, we've got all sorts of properties, and this is it's really too bad we don't have the audio because it's really good. But it's like there are investors thinking about the education of your children, right, as a profit-making enterprise. Okay, that's how they think about it. And so it's a really good example. I'm sorry that didn't work out. We'll fix it next time, I guess. Okay, so now the question to ask is, all this education reform stuff is almost always about, how do we close the achievement gap? How do we create educational equality, right? Because there are real issues of racism and classism and all sorts of other stuff in terms of education. So all of it gets framed around this agenda, or at least the presumption that it's all about educational equality and it's going to fix these things, right? That's the logic. So that's the presumption that goes into it. So we have to ask the question, is that really the case, right? Here's a couple examples of how it gets framed. Let's go back a few years, right? 2002, George W. Education is the great civil rights issue of our time. I bet you've all heard that before. 2004, Rod Page, former U.S. Secretary of Education. The education achievement gap is the civil rights issue of our time. Arnie Duncan in 2011, education is the civil rights movement of our generation. Barack Obama, 2011, education is the civil rights issue of our time. And then Condoleezza Rice, 2012, education is the civil rights movement of our day, right? I say there is probably no other single issue alive today that you can find such agreement amongst both Democrats and Republicans, right? Besides education and equality by their framing, okay? And then even more recently, Condoleezza was really helpful. Just last fall, she said something really good that's worth highlighting. Poor black kids trapped in failing neighborhood schools, that's the biggest race problem of today. That's the biggest civil rights issue of today. Anybody who wasn't in favor of school choice, anybody who wasn't in favor of educational reform, anybody who defends the status quo in the educational system, that's racist to me. And she's actually talking about unions specifically in that quote. All right? So clearly there's a racial project around educational reform, right? That's the basis for this whole thing. So let's take a look at some of the outcomes, okay? So will these reforms actually improve educational achievement for low-income and students of color? Do these reforms challenge racism? That's a really good question, right? Do these reforms represent something fundamentally and foundationally better than public schools? And then the lurking question is, whose interests are served with these reforms? So I'm going to work through a few different reforms just as examples, okay? High-stakes standardized testing. Current law requires testing. We know where we stand in Washington State. We lost our waiver. We lost our NCLB waiver, right? I don't know if you've been keeping track of that. And because we wouldn't require tests to be used in the evaluation of teachers by our state law. So they said, okay, you need to stick to the mandates of NCLB. High-stakes standardized testing is always about accountability, right? This idea that the public reporting of scores will hold teachers and schools accountable, okay? Test data is the foundation of this whole entire machine, right? The test scores are the fuel for the machine. Without any test data, none of this works because the tests are used to compare everybody. And if you have no comparison, you have no market. And then if you have no market, you don't have any of these reforms, okay? And then I always have to note this whole idea of value-added measurement, that you can isolate just how much an individual teacher increases a student's test score, and they're proclaiming to be able to do this. It's really junk science. If you just look into the basics of it, you'll find out that, like, the American Statistical Association released a statement against it just late last year. It's just too sloppy. It doesn't really work. It's too rife with errors. But sadly enough, you see the entire Obama administration and everybody sort of moving forward with this right now. So, based on the research, the empirical effects of high-stakes standardized testing. When you attach stakes to tests, anything that's not tested gets squeezed out of the curriculum. That's really well known, okay? Particularly if you're talking about areas of low schools or classrooms where there's low performance. We're also seeing the disappearance of art and social studies, right? In Seattle, there's a big fight over lunch and PE. Students now in Seattle elementary schools get 20 minutes for lunch, right? And it's all because of the squeeze of the test, because administrators are like, man, we got to bump our test scores, better have more test prep, okay? So let's more time focus on this stuff and less on these things, which is really stupid because we know the research says, like, play actually helps kids do better academically. We know that, but rarely do these things have anything to do with research these days. That's the sad thing is, like, the more I deal with education policy, the more I realize none of these guys care about research. All they care is about the politics and the ideology involved. We also see more teacher-centered instruction because of the tests, and then also a rise, like I talked about before, in scripted curriculum for low-performing schools, okay? So what about tests and race and class, okay? All of the effects I just talked about, okay, are actually concentrated on low-income kids of color, right? Because that's where failure, according to the tests, if the tests are your metric, then failure is concentrated in low-income communities of color. So all these effects around the restricted curriculum, the loss of the subjects, happens at a higher rate for low-income and kids of color than anybody else, okay? Where in some schools, some cases, there's no social studies for these kids, or no recess at all, right? And they're just jamming them into doing literacy and mathematics only because they want to push up the test scores, okay? And it's critically important to make the point that this kind of curriculum that these low-income kids of color are getting is of a wholly different quality than the affluent schools, okay, and also elite private schools. That there's essentially we're getting essentially a tiered school system where high-performing students get allowed to have this this enriching curriculum and more arts and liberal arts and that kind of stuff, and then low-performing kids, low-income kids of color, more and more are just having this like test-based curriculum, and so you get these. It's almost like tracking by schools in a sense. Also, what we're seeing based on the high-stakes testing is a loss of multicultural curriculum, right? Because if it's not on the test, it's not going to be taught. Right, so where's the incentive for teachers to be like, oh man, this is a great book written by this author of color that maybe deals with some social justice issues, but we can't. It's not on the test. I can't spend my time doing that. We're actually seeing that now with the Common Core. All right, I don't know if you look at this list of suggested books for the Common Core. It's a huge list of 300, 200 authors, 200 books, and someone did a count and they were like, there's only like 5 authors of color on in the whole pile. Right? Like, you're really seeing something lost when you set the standards that way and you set the assessments that way, then you lose these incentives to actually deal with multicultural curriculum. Oh, and the flip side, sorry, there's also, in the midst of that loss, then also you lose space for culturally relevant instruction as well, because that's curriculum instruction are they're part of the same heart and body, and so the way you teach kids is just as important as what you're teaching them. And so if you lose the multicultural curriculum, you're also losing the pedagogy in the same stroke. Now, I also want to point out that high-stakes standardized testing actually contributes to the schools-to-prison pipeline in a couple ways. For one, this whole framework around high-stakes accountability creates a culture of discipline, right? It's disciplinarity, right? You're not teaching to learn. You're not in your classroom to learn. You're in the classroom to get a high test score, and you're teaching to save your job, right? And you're getting a score on that test in order to ensure your survival, to get out of that school, right? It just changes the whole frame. So it creates a culture of punishment and discipline and surveillance. Okay, it moves things in a prison-like direction. There was also a 2013 study that actually found that standards-based exit exams increased the rate of incarceration by 12.5%. Right? Because what happens if you fail the exit exam? You don't graduate high school, right? And then not graduating high school has a direct connection to your probability of being incarcerated, right? So you can make this argument that the high stakes tests for exit exams, at least, contributes directly to the schools to prison pipeline. Oh, and then we know, it goes without saying, we know that the failure on the tests and then who gets into prison it ends up being predominantly low income and black and brown kids. So. Okay, let's take a minute and look at charter schools as another example and ask these same questions around race and equality, okay? Real briefly, charter schools, there's both for-profit and non-profit. Most people don't know this, but charter schools actually originated with the teachers' unions, right? Albert Schenker, and the idea was the original idea was to have a school that could be innovative, that would be with the cooperation of the union and the districts, to be sort of a place to incubate good ideas on how to work with hard-to-reach kids, and then bring those back into the public schools. That was like the original, and they're like community schools, really, the original conception of charter schools. They've become a whole other thing. Now they're a key part of the corporate education reform agenda, right? This whole thing around deregulation and competition, right? They generally lack public accountability, and like I just said, they become a vehicle for deregulating public schools. So let's look at charter school performance. It's amazing how many times we have to keep doing these studies to keep showing the same thing, right? Charter schools, roughly 20 to 25% outperform public schools, regular public schools. Roughly 50% do the same, and then roughly 25 to 30% do worse than public schools, right? And this isn't just to bash charters, it's more to say, these things get pitched as a silver bullet for educational equality, but when you look at the actual data, you're like, well, depending how you want to frame it, I might say, I might say, well, you know what? Maybe 70 to 75%, maybe 75 to 80% of public schools actually outperform charter, do as good or outperform charters, right? I mean, it's not a magic bullet by any way, shape, or form. And actually, the distribution is probably about the same as what you have for public schools anyways, right? You have some high performing, some low performing, and a bunch in the middle. So charter schools are supposed to be public schools, right? And the whole idea is, they're open for everybody. Well, we're finding out this is not the case, okay? And again, remember, charter schools are put out there as one of these things to solve educational equity issues for most largely poor black and brown kids. So here's how charter schools control who gets into their classrooms. They make applications available for just a few hours every year, right? You got to be in the circuit and have the cultural capital to know when those apps are going to be available. Have lengthy application forms, require report cards from previous schools, make students and parents write essays, right? You already know you're going to be locking out English language learners to some degree if you do that, right? Ask for test scores, ask for disciplinary records from previous schools, medical records, ask for teacher recommendations, give exams, even asking for social security cards in some cases, which actually is technically illegal, asking for birth certificates, doing family interviews, having academic prerequisites, and also having formal documentation of disabilities. Right? So yes, charter schools are supposed to be open to everybody, but they're finding ways to like filter who actually gets in, right? Because that can skew your results. So one good example of this, Steve Perry's Capital Prep in Connecticut, and Steve Perry he's like on MSNBC, he's like a media darling, and Capital Prep boasts a 100% college acceptance rate. That's amazing, right? So let's check it out. So Capital Prep is actually here in green. That's the only green one. This is the percent of free and reduced lunch students from Capital Prep's in the Hartford area, okay? So right here, you probably can't see the number. That's 40%. So he's a little above 40% free and reduced lunch. And this is how he compares to peer schools in the area, okay? So somehow, Capital Prep, with its 100% college acceptance rate, actually has significantly fewer poor kids in it. That's what to take away from that. And then here's percentage of students with disabilities, right? Capital Prep's in green. Oh, wow. They have like hardly any students with disabilities, especially compared to the rest of the schools, most of the rest of the schools in the area. English language learners. So you notice the pattern, right? Here's in green again. And then here's another big one, attrition rates. One of the charter schools are happy, like you'll see KIPP make this, they'll brag about how many of their students get into college. And you're like, well, but didn't you start with like 30% less kids in 9th grade and now then you have graduating? So here's Capital Prep. The class of 2011 had a 35% attrition rate, okay, between freshman year and senior year. Class of 2010 had 36%, and the class of 2009 had a 14% attrition rate. So you know what, I can have really high graduation rates too. I just got to get rid of all my bad students. That's easy, okay? Okay, another piece is around attrition and discipline in charter schools, right? Some places like Chicago and Connecticut, charters are actually expelling or suspending kids of color at much higher rates than everyone else, okay? So much so that Arnie Duncan had to speak out to the charter schools and say, you all need to chill out with the suspensions. But here's the thing. We knew that suspensions increase the likelihood of dropouts, and then suspension or expulsion actually increases by 3 times the likelihood of getting involved in the juvenile justice system in the following year, right? So again, not only do we have the tests and the failure on tests potentially contributing to getting involved with the justice system, but then the increased suspension rates of charter schools. So, to me, whenever I hear charter proponents talk about charters helping race and class inequality, I'm like, when I look at the data, I don't see it, right? You just got to call bullshit sometimes, I think. A quick thing on here, Washington State. This is from my own work with also Joe Farrar, who some of you might be familiar with. Joe's a good friend of mine. We both went to Madison. And so we worked on some pieces around looking at charter school reform in Washington State and some of the race and class implications of that, okay? We call it policy for other people's children. So real brief, you're not really going to be able to see this in back, but this is the list. Washington State had a big initiative, and Charter School Initiative 1240, and there was a big campaign. At the time, it was the 3rd largest initiative campaign in terms of funding in Washington State history. It got pushed down the list because of the alcohol initiative and also the legalization of marijuana initiative. So they had it was like $10.9 million for the Yes on 1240 campaign to have charter schools legalized here. So if you look at it, you can see Gates is up here. He gave the most. It's over $3 million to that campaign. Here's Alice Walton, right? That's daughter of Walmart founder Sam Walton. and also chair of the board for the Walton Foundation. Vulcan Inc. is actually Paul Allen, Nick Hanauer, tech venture capitalist, Mike Bezos, right, and Jackie Bezos, the parents of Jeff Bezos from Amazon.com. Here's some local folks right here, Ann Dinning and Michael Wolf. They manage some investment firms, and Wolf's on the Yahoo board of directors. Eli Broad's another big one to know here. Okay, he's a real estate mogul from New York. Doris Fisher, okay, Gap co-founder. And so what happened is we looked at this like, man, these are all the donations to the campaign that are 50,000 or greater. Okay, that's 21 people or organizations, like Microsoft's right here. There's a couple or Education Reform Now. Yeah, Netflix folks, Reed Hastings. So these people actually contributed somewhere around 97% of the money for the campaign. These 21 people, individuals, and organizations accounted for 97% of the campaign, roughly. All right. And so Joe and I were like, man, some of these people we know have foundations. Gates Foundation. We know the Walton Family Foundation is big in education reform. We know the Broad Foundation is big in education reform. So then we were like, okay, let's look at this, and let's look at that list of who did this compared to who gave this money compared to their foundations and the people who ran the campaign. And I jumped that point. The folks who ran the Yes on 1240 campaign, it was 3 nonprofits, okay, plus Democrats for Education Reform. It was Stand for Children, League of Education Voters, Partnership for Learning. Those are the 3 local nonprofits. And then Democrats for Education Reform is also an advocacy group that does this kind of reform work. They controlled the campaign. They did the media messaging. They did all, like, they gave staff time. They're the ones who did the whole thing around Yes on 1240. And there's a 5th organization called the Center on Reinventing Public Education, which is a research think tank. And they produced a report that conveniently said Yes on 1240 was a great charter school law for Washington State. Okay, so those players, we knew those nonprofits and organizations were doing this work. We saw these guys giving the money, and some of these guys are linked to some foundations. So then we said, okay, let's look at that real quick. Okay, so on the left-hand side are the 5 organizations we saw as being leadership in the Yes on 1240 campaign, right? On the far right are the foundations and the amounts of money that they got from the foundations. So Center on Reinventing Public Education, Bill Gates, Walton, and Broad Foundations, Ed Reform Now, Broad, you see Fisher, Corbell, oops, no, we'll go back. Corbell Lumps is actually Ann Wolf and Michael Dinning from the other list, Foundation, Bezos Family. So you can see, like, Lachlan is connected to one of those other, like Goldman Sachs. This is funny, Goldman Sachs actually has a donor-advised fund, and I found out through my research that actually Paul Allen and his wife directed Goldman Sachs to get to their foundation to give money to Stand for Children, right? You can see, so like, wow, these guys gave a lot of money, and so then let's put this whole pile together to look at Washington State, okay? So what you see right here in the middle is the campaign for Yes for Charters in Washington State. These solid dots right here around this, these are the 21 donors, okay? On the outside ring mainly are the foundations, and then you see, let's see, League of Education Voters here, Partnership for Learning, Stand for Children, Center for Reinventing Public Education, Ed Reform Now. So these are the folks who ran the campaign. So what you see is actually this complex network, a very powerful network of folks individually giving direct money to have charter schools in Washington State, and then organizationally through their foundations giving money to the nonprofits and the other advocacy organizations pushing charter schools in Washington State and running the campaign. Now 1240 only passed by 41,000 votes. It was like a 50.69% majority. Okay, less than a 1% majority. All right. And so in some ways you might argue that it took this to push it over the edge, right? Which says something about Washington State, because we've actually voted charters down 3 times previously, okay? And so this is what, let's see, what's my next slide? And this is Joe and I arguing, look, so here's a bunch of rich folks, right, giving directly to the charter program, to the charter school law, using their foundations also to support it. And this is why we argue, like, this isn't, Bill Gates is not giving money to do charter schools because he's going to send his kids to the charter schools. right? This is largely a bunch of rich white folks trying to push a policy through, right, for low-income kids of color in Washington State, okay? Because one thing you should notice about all this, there aren't any sort of grassroots organizations from communities of color involved in this. There weren't any involved in the Yes on 1240 campaign, I'll tell you that, okay? And in fact, El Centro de la Raza and King County NAACP came out against Initiative 1240, okay? So that's why we call it other people's policy. So charter big takeaway. They don't really outperform public schools. They don't really serve low-income students of color they're supposed to. They lose or kick out large numbers of their students. They fundamentally contribute to the schools to prison pipeline, and they're pushed by wealthy elites for other people's children. So I think it's a con game wrapped around, like framed around equity when it's not really doing that. School closings, another piece to look at. So the idea is that underperforming schools, like businesses, should be closed, okay? There's been a huge lack of follow-through by charter proponents. We see lots of charter schools underperforming, doing badly, and they're just not closing them, okay? It's done sometimes under the guise of demographic shifts or economic crises, and then also school failure. This is a really great slide. Comes from I can't remember, the OTL campaign. I'm trying to remember what it's called. Do you remember? Yeah, Opportunity to Learn campaign. Here's Chicago, New York, and Philly, just as 3 examples that they used. And you can look at Chicago. They were going to close. They were planning on closing 54 schools. They ended up closing around 50. But let's look at the affected students, right? 54 schools, 88% are black, 10% Latino, 94% low income, 0.7% white. Right? It's not like they're running out to the Chicago suburbs to close down schools, okay? New York City, 26 schools will be closed, 59% black, 43% Latino, 82% low income. Philadelphia, 23 schools, 81% black, 11% Latino, 93% low income. All right? Now, some people are actually charging, and sometimes I think this is really true, that school closures is not an educational program, it's actually a real estate and gentrification program. Because here's what can happen. A charter operator can come take over your school, and a lot of these leases say that if the charter school closes, the property moves over to the charter management organization to control. Okay? And so you actually see like this being pitched as an idea for the revitalization of neighborhoods through the closing of schools, essentially. All right? So that's right. It's a real estate plan, not an educational plan. And I was thinking about this in Seattle because they're just closing down a long-time community center in the International District, one of the gyms that a lot of the Asian American leagues have played at for a number of years, and that's where the Summit Charter School, which also got like a $4 million grant from Gates or something, is going to renovate and open. And I started thinking about this this is literally like in the last couple months. This is what happened in Seattle. So let's put pieces together. Okay, a couple big picture examples so we can see what happens. All right. Take New Orleans. Post-Hurricane Katrina, the entire public district is dismantled. Teachers union gets disbanded. It becomes 100% charters. Many of the charter schools become staffed by Teach for America Corps members, right? And then they run into all sorts of enrollment and disciplinary issues. Okay. And I'm pretty clear about Teach for America when I talk about it. I think there are a lot of good-hearted folks who go into Teach for America, and I think a lot of them are ignorant, literally ignorant and naive. They don't know what Teach for America is doing or is being used for around the country. And you see these spaces where like the charter schools are saying, we'll only open a charter if you give us Teach for America recruits, right? Because they don't want to have unions, okay? And so TFA ends up being used as a wedge against teachers' unions and unionized teachers, all right? And then Chicago's another good example. Mayor Rahm closed 40 schools last year, laid off a whole bunch of teachers, same year. And then they found a memo from Rahm's office that they had planned to open 50 new charters and that they were going to require using TFA Corps members to staff them. Okay? So you see how like it kind of like all this stuff kind of happens, you know? Okay, so let's talk about achievement and racial identity. One of the arguments I like to make is like, we know from research, there's been 2 studies about the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, 2 formal studies, that actually correlated the ethnic studies program there with the achievement of working class Latino kids, right? By whatever metrics you want, college going, graduation rates, whatever, okay? Recent studies about positive racial identity for African Americans as a way to mitigate the effects of institutionalized racism, okay? And so we know this, all right? So one of the things I always like to point out to these reformers is like, why aren't corporate reformers promoting K-12 ethnic studies programs? We've got research to support that they work for fixing and improving the educational achievement for the very kids that they claim to be working for, right? And, you know, I don't know, Gates Foundation, they got millions and millions and billions of dollars. Maybe they should roll out a $500 million campaign to promote K-12 ethnic studies across the country, right? But they won't do that because they have a different political agenda. And they don't see the world in those terms, okay? Because that would be that's not the market, right? That's politics, okay? I'd like to talk, I talk about this framing around education reform, around this concept of neoliberal multiculturalism, which is Jody Malamed's work. And she talks about neoliberal multiculturalism as a unifying discourse. She says, as a unifying discourse, neoliberal multiculturalism has disguised the reality that neoliberalism remains a force of racial capitalism. Race has continued to permeate capitalism's economic and social processes, organizing the hyper-extraction of surplus value from racialized bodies and naturalizing a system of capital accumulation. Yet multiculturalism has portrayed neoliberal policy as the key to a post-racist world of freedom and opportunity. And we see that now, right? Education for the global economy. Right? You better go learn some Mandarin because China is going to take over the world, right? That's this framing around multiculturalism. So revisiting Condoleezza's statement, poor black kids trapped in failing neighborhood schools, that's the biggest race problem of today. That's the biggest civil rights issue of today. Anyone who isn't in favor of school choice, anyone who isn't in favor of educational reform, anyone who defends the status quo in the educational system, that's racist to me. So I'm trying to pull these together. I see the way education reform is being framed now, this corporate education reform agenda, as a manifestation of neoliberal multiculturalism, right? Here's this idea that we can attend to the needs of communities of color through the free market process. And that's this assumption that's going on. And it's also, this is a critical point, it's a colonial project, okay? So the idea is that it gets framed that free market capitalism will meet the needs of children and communities of color as well as other marginalized groups and increase educational equality in the process through deregulation and the marketization of public institutions. In doing so, neoliberal multiculturalism serves to obfuscate and hide the capitalist production of racism under the guise of free market anti-racism, right? Because this is a free market anti-racism that we're seeing in these education reforms. And that's not to say it's really anti-racist, but it's framed as anti-racist within the context of free market, despite all prevailing evidence to the contrary. Further, neoliberal multiculturalism also serves to justify the process of accumulation of wealth for elites through structures and processes that dispossess the public, particularly communities of color and the poor, of the capital investments made by the state. And that last piece to me is critical because if all the failure is concentrated in low-income communities of color, and then all these free market reforms, right, get focused on those communities as the way to supposedly fix them, but it's a free market reform, so what is it doing? It's accumulation by dispossession. It's pulling the state resources in those areas out of those communities and putting into the private market. Okay? It is a colonial project. All right? So, resist. My mantra is always resist, resist, resist wherever possible. Resistance is always contextual. We have to keep that in mind. Constantly, I'm working to educate and expose people to be thinking about this stuff. I think we need more activist teachers unions. I'm a critic of teachers unions. I'm also a supporter of teachers unions. All right, because I know many. I'm friends with Bob Peterson, who's a really good radical activist, who's head of the Milwaukee Teachers Union, the Chicago Teachers Union. Has been wonderful. Progressive leadership took over the United Teachers of LA. There's really good work, and what those guys do is when their union contract comes up, they don't go just to fight around pay and benefits, which that's part of it. But really what the fight is when these good unions do their work, they say this is a fight about quality education, right? It imperative for the quality of your child's education that there only be 25 kids in the classroom instead of 35, right? Because the quality of education I can give your kid is amplified when I have 10 less in every class, right? Like that's a community issue, right? And so these unions have done a really good jobs of like bringing in parents and students and saying, okay, this is about what is best for all of us as educators, what's best for your education. And that's what I think the activist teachers union need to be doing. We, even here in Washington State, we have too much capitulation from the unions around some of this stuff. We need strategic organizing locally. One of the best things happening right now in Seattle is like I said before, around the cuts in lunch and recess. So there's been a sort of a grassroots movement around the fight over recess and lunch, right? But what it is, it ends up being, it got triggered by a bunch of more affluent white parents in North Seattle because they're pissed off. They're like, man, my kid doesn't have recess, and so we're going to organize and do all this stuff. They're using their cultural capital to do some of this work. But here's the thing, that creates this opportunity because the cutting of recess and stuff is actually sharper in the low-income schools and the schools with more kids of color, right? So that creates this opportunity to sort of bring a cross-racial analysis around this. And then the other thing is this, the cuts in recess and stuff are because of the testing. So that brings this other space to kind of organize around the testing. So that's a really, like, finding these little pockets of resistance and figuring out ways to, like, connect the issues and connect communities is a critical piece of that. But that's really locally based. You're not going to be able to find that everywhere, right? The recess thing just popped up in Seattle. Who knows? That could be happening in Bellingham. I don't know. Building networks is critical. None of us are alone in this work. If you just resist as a lone individual, that's brave and gallant, but it also means that you're going to lose your job, right? Or whatever, right? Versus like the teachers at Garfield High School actually all voted together to boycott the MAP tests a couple years ago, and that was a huge thing, and they couldn't fire all the teachers. In fact, none of them got disciplined in the end, right? So you're always stronger together. The other thing is, more than just being effective, building your networks just helps your soul, right? This is hard work, right? And we're out here like working with kids that we love, right, in communities that we love and doing this incredible work, but we're also doing it in this context where we're under increasing like attack. Even me in like teacher education, I'm feeling that, right? And so having networks of people who can support you, who can help educate you, who you can be involved in educating, and just sort of like, you just got to build around yourself because it becomes a protective, shield for your soul in this work. And so that's the other piece about doing networks and just being stronger on the inside too. I see the opt-out and the test refusal movement as a critical piece of resistance in all of this stuff. Like I said, the test data is the fuel for the entire machine here, right? If you don't have test data, you can't do anything. And so when parents start pushing it and saying, well, we're not going to have our kids take the test, that like freaks everybody out. Administrators go, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on? And then the state is like, yo, you can't do that, right? And you go, well, show me the constitutional provision that says I can't do it. Don't I have the right over my kids' education? And then you get this fight. There's constitutional fights right now about what are parents' rights around being able to opt out their kids from tests. Right, and you get different answers from different places. Jersey, I think, was just saying, or Florida, was just saying like the state just said no. Parents have to have their kids take the tests. And you're like, well, make us then, right? I mean, what are you going to do, right? So it's really powerful when people start talking about not taking the test. There's the old saying, what if they had a war and no one came? And so we've been saying now, what if we gave a test and no one took it? Right? And that's like they wouldn't even know what to do. It like just short circuits everything. There are right now there's a big fight in Philly. There's a middle school that had 20% of the parents opted out, right? And now they're investigating the teachers and they're trying to discipline the teachers because the teachers were involved not in advocating opting out, but in educating the parents and letting them know about their rights. So now teachers are getting busted for educating people about their rights. Right, around opting out, like it's crazy, right? But you can see these fights are very, very critical, very critical. But when 20% of parents opt out of a test like that, you know what that does? It invalidates the scores for the entire school, and so that you can't. And then suddenly, imagine that, they just don't know what to do with them, right? You can't rank them. You can't evaluate the teachers. You can't, like, suddenly it's just not part of the system anymore when that happens. So, and then there's strategic tests, positioning around like Common Core testing, for instance. And I hope you all know the cut scores for Common Core, if you're aware of like about the smarter balance testing that's about to hit everybody. And you all graduated, all these students are out of the system, that part of the system now. So you're like, don't have to deal with that. But there's going to be, this spring when the smarter balance testing, which is the Common Core testing, comes to Washington State, they've set the cut scores already. Okay, so you have to score, what is it? You have to score, I can't remember, 3 or higher to pass, and they're actually expecting there to be like 65% to 70% failure at every single subject at every grade that they're giving it, right? There's about to be like 65% failure in the state, okay? So like this thing is coming and it's gonna like blow everything up, right? But there's a lot of strategic positioning around the Common Core testing, both good and bad, because to me there's a bunch of sort of really far right-wing conservatives who are like, oh, I don't want the feds treading on me, and so you need to not do Common Core, not do the testing. Those folks are there, and they're a pocket of resistance. And there's also a lot of good, like, progressive left critique of the way Common Core is constructed and the problems of the test. And those folks are there. And so there's people who are working in sort of loose coalitions at times. And so that's an interesting thing. I wouldn't advocate that for like making the revolution or something. But in terms of like thinking strategically about Common Core and trying to get some stuff done, it's actually, an interesting space to be thinking about working. Actually, the Washington State Democrat Committee just passed a resolution against Common Core, right? And the Republicans did it already. And so suddenly you have Democrats and Republicans in Washington State, and like, so you can see some of that strategic positioning happening politically here. So anyways, I think we're being played by fools is my conclusion. Education right now is a huge industry. I also think it's part of a plan to attack the 2 largest unions in the United States, right? There's been an ongoing attack against organized labor, and the teachers' unions are the 2 biggest unions, and I think that's one of the big political fish that these guys are going after. We need to understand this as a colonial extraction of resources from communities of color, right? So instead of actually investing in those communities, right, because of state budget cuts and tax cuts, we're disinvesting at the state level, and then what little money is going into those communities is getting sucked out through these privatization mechanisms, okay? And I think it's all diversion from dealing with poverty, right? Because education policy is economic policy, it's social policy, it's all these things. Like schools and education do not stand on their own, right? They're part of this large network of social services, and really they're about the health, a good place to sort of take the temperature and judge the health of the nation, of the kids. And we can't forget that piece, all right? And I think that's it. So thank you.